Hello, we are Andrea.
Gala.
Frida.
Javier.
And Julian.
And this is our timeline project along with the vocabulary words. We'll start off with said vocabulary words.
Number 1, coalescence. It is the possibility that two or more materials are joined in one single body. Number 2, the Doppler effect. When an object that emits a sonorous wave is closer to an observer, the waves compress as they get closer. Therefore, the sound is louder as the frequency increases.
Number 3, evolution. It is a series of natural processes that contribute to transform the characteristics of a species in generations and lead them to adapt to the environment. 4, natural selection. It is a phenomenon of evolution which suggests that the conditions of an environment favor or hinder the survival of organisms, and because of this, populations evolve to become more adequate for survival.
Number 5, taxonomy is the science that deals with the principles, methods, and purposes of the classification for the hierarchical and systematized ordering of the groups of animals and vegetables. The domain, number 6, the domain. It is the taxonomy category used in the systems of biological classification above the kingdom and superkingdom.
Number 7, Big Bang. The rapid expansion of matter from a state of extremely high density and temperature that, according to current cosmological theories, marked the origin of the universe.
And finally, number 8, biochemistry, which is the branch of science concerned with the chemical and physical-chemical processes and substances that occur within living organisms.
Theories of the origin of the universe. The 16th century was when the Copernican revolution took place. It was characterized by the heliocentric theory, which suggested that the solar system had the sun in the center. Moving on to the 19th century, it was understood that a group of suns located at different distances existed, and these were called galaxies. Then, in the 20th century, the universe became a vast, wide, and deep space with many galaxies similar to ours. In that same century, in 1917, Albert Einstein deduced that some force was pushing bodies in an opposite and proportional direction to gravitational attraction. This created a state of equilibrium. This is how he postulated his theory of relativity. 5 years later, in 1922, Alexander Friedmann suggested the oscillating or pulsating theory. This is what he said was that following the initial explosion, matter stopped and contracted, generating a new concentration of matter with high density, which would cause another explosion. 2 years later, in 1924, Edwin Hubble discovered that there were other galaxies other than the Milky Way. He tried to calculate the distance between some galaxies and ours. 3 years after, in 1927, Georges Lemaître suggested the Big Bang theory. This theory deduces the universe didn't collapse upon itself because of gravity that countered a more powerful force that came from a great explosion. This theory, however, lacks evidence in causes of the explosion, and this is why most people don't believe it. A year later, in 1928, Hubble discovered that the universe was not in stillness. Based on the Doppler effect, he discovered that galaxies are moving further apart while they are red. This because red electromagnetic waves are of greater longitude and blue are short waves. 20 years later, in 1948, George Gamow predicted that the explosion started from an infinitely dense and heated matter. He also said that photons must have been released and cooled down, which would have caused a glare that should be visible today. Simultaneously, Ralph Alpher and Robert Herman calculated the loss of heat of the light emitted by the explosion. They created a model predicting the cooling of said heat. They concluded that ancient electromagnetic waves that should still be moving through the universe would be 5 degrees Kelvin. This was called background radiation. In that same year, Fred Hoyle, Herman Bondi, and Thomas Gold were suspicious of the lack of evidence of the Big Bang Theory. They said the universe was infinite and eternal, and they found a contradiction of the theory of relativity and continuous creation of matter. This being because the scarce, slow generation of matter didn't agree with said theory. Their idea was that the universe expanded and new matter would be created, and from this new matter, new galaxies would form. Finally, in 1981, Alan Guth added to the Big Bang Theory as well as the oscillating theory and tried to solve its many problems. He said that during the first seconds of the explosion, matter expanded in an exponential or inflationary way, having a constant acceleration and agreeing with the homogeneity in space.
Evolution, history, and evidences of evolution. In the 18th century, illustrated thinkers came up with the theory that nature could be explained by processes of change and transformation that would create new spaces. After that, Carlos Linnaeus accepted that new species of plants could appear as time went by. This was the asexual crossing of organisms of different species, and this theory is still considered true to this day. George Louis Leclerc had a theory that stated that there were 3 reasons by which species could be modified, which were diet, climate, and customs. He also thought that animals could migrate between continents and the environmental challenges could be solved by changing their habits to adapt. During the 19th century, Lamarck stated that the 3 reasons of Leclerc were the cause of hypothetical process of increase in the complexity of human beings and living things. He called this theory the march of nature. Charles Darwin stated that populations of species change over time due to natural selection, in which organisms adapt to their environment in order to have a higher survival rate. In 1859, Darwin wrote The Origin of the Species, in which he talks about the 3 aspects of evolution, which were adaptation, transformation, and diversification. Within the origin of the species, he included 7 complementary theories about the evolution process, such as a result of natural selection, species adapt to the changing environment, all living things species come from common ancestor, and other theories. During the modern era, scientists use fossils to research about evolution. This is by carrying out an anatomical comparison between extinct and modern species to determine similar characteristics. Other methods used in our modern world are morphological comparison and biogenomics, which is by DNA. Now, during the 20th century, there has been many new discoveries, as well as new ways of researching about evolution, which could work in the absence of natural selection.
Origin of life, chemical evolution, and biological evolution. First, in 1809, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, first naturalist who tried to offer an explanation on the origin of life, reformulating the ancient theory of spontaneous creation. It wasn't until 1809 where Lamarck's new version of this same theory appealed to explain the origin of life by microbes. Next, in 1850, where Louis Pasteur felt compelled to combat this spontaneous generation theory for lack of evidence. Therefore, he designed an experiment and demonstrated that organic matter, such as microbes that had been eliminated by heating, didn't decompose, proving his theory. Then, in 1923, Alexander Ivanovich Oparin, where in the origin of life, he proposed that life on Earth had originated in a primary atmosphere, different from our present one. Besides, he proposed that the first living beings, unicellular and anaerobic microbes, must have risen starting from inorganic matter, which transformed by a process of chemical evolution. Next, in 1950, Harold Urey and Stan L. Miller, they decided to collaborate together to make an experiment which would represent a reducing atmosphere of primitive Earth. Then in 1953, it wasn't until 1953 where Urey and Miller's experiment gave surprising results, where Miller designed a system of tubes and flasks which isolated from the exterior to simulate the hydrosphere as well as the atmosphere of primitive Earth. In 1960, Alexander Rich, Carl Woese, Leslie Orgel, and Francis Crick. Due to the varied considerations about which were the molecules with which life began, these scientists independently proposed existence of a first biological world based on DNA, RNA, and proteins. In 1980, in this year, the evidence in favor of the theories made by the scientists arrived, when small molecules of RNA were discovered in living beings that perform catalytic functions of molecular compounds, that is, in a manner analog to enzymes. And for this, the phenomenon was interpreted as a reminiscence of the world of RNA.
Now for the theories of evolution, we have 1831, in the year which Charles Darwin traveled the world for 5 years, and this voyage provided him with unique experiences in Argentina and the Galapagos Islands especially. In Argentina, he identified what seemed to be an unheard of species of the American ostrich. He then sent the skeleton to a specialist who proved him right. He made tons of prominent discoveries for science of the sort, the most notable being a variety of bird species named finches, which he sent to specialists and forgot about for the rest of the trip. In 1836, when Darwin got home, the specialist that had received the finches notified Darwin that he had sent a collection of never-before-described species of finches. Darwin knew that similar species existed nowhere else but the Galapagos. The resemblance was almost precise, except for the beak's shape and the size. Darwin was sure that these differences favored the birds in their respective environments. In 1838, after 2 years of incessant research about the finch's differences and similarities, the idea of natural selection came to him in an untimely manner. To Darwin, members of the same species had similar characteristics and needs, so therefore, they had to compete for basic resources like food. The animal with more competent and advantageous features would obviously win. Darwin thought that as generations went on, the offspring would adapt to their circumstances in order to survive the contest of life. In 1855, Darwin knew he had the answer to the post problem, but still couldn't prove it to others for the lack of evidence. For 20 years, he relentlessly tried to collect evidence to favor his theory as to not be rejected by critics, so he began writing a book in 1855 to postulate his theory. In 1858, a young naturalist called Alfred Wallace, who had had similar experiences to Darwin's, sent him a letter suggesting that individuals with different characteristics would occasionally appear, and if these differences were for natural advantage purposes. He supposed that as time went on and the differences increased, a new species would eventually form. This species would then work to eliminate the original or mother species. And finally, in 1859, Darwin finished and published his book, The Origin of the Species, after having read Wallace's letter.
Taxonomy, purposes, classification, and five kingdoms. And since 384 until 322 before Christ, Aristotle created the first classification, the first system of classification, and he ordered the animals into large groups, animals and animals. Animals are the ones with red blood, while animals are the ones with blood with different colors. In Middle Ages, the classification had a practical use, where some animals were catalogued as bestiaries, and other forms was based on evidence characteristics. For example, those that fly, that are edible, the ones that produce venom, and others. In 1735, Linneo was the one who set the rules in his book, Systema Naturae. He determined that species would be ordered in classification taxonomy categories. The order was kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. In 19th century, Lamarck classified them based on the presence of spinal column and cranium. The vertebrates were the ones that have spinal column and cranium and red blood, and invertebrates blood of other colors, and they were lack of cranium and spinal cord. In 1866, Haeckel created a system of three kingdoms of living beings. He designated the Protista name to place all unicellular organisms. He discovered two main types: true cells, which has the nucleus in its interior, and bacteria, which were more simpler and smaller cells. And he called them Monera, the subdivision Monera. Also, he talked about Plantae and Animalia kingdom. In 1925, Edward Chadon named cells with nucleus eukaryotes and identified that these nucleated cells have a series of organelles that perform a specific function. In 1939, Herbert Copeland separated bacteria from the Protista kingdom, creating for them the fourth kingdom of cells without organelles, and it was the Monera. In 1959, Robert Whittaker formalized the fifth kingdom of life, which he called fungi, which were organisms with strange forms, gray and obscure colors. In 1977, Carl Huss studied the sequence of nucleotides of genes originating from a diversity of species representing all kingdoms. He described the existence of a new taxonomic category superior to kingdoms that he called domains. In 1985, Karin Schwartz published a book titled Fifth Kingdoms, in which she includes description, photographs, and schematization of species. Same year, Margulis and Schwartz create a new category called super kingdoms, and they divide them into two big ones. Crocodile super kingdom, in which they left a single kingdom of organisms without nucleus, Monera, or also bacteria. And under this one, they create two kingdoms, subkingdoms, Eubacteria and Archaeobacteria. And finally, the Eukaryote superkingdom, in which they left the four resistant kingdoms, the Protista, Plantae, fungi, and animals.
Thank you for your attention.